I mean, Florida is very much part of the South, to be sure. And no one before World War II would have thought of Florida as an appendage of New York. Right? That's only a recent thing. Really only in the last 50 years or so.
Yeah.
The Florida secedes. It's part of the Confederacy. Just look at Florida's state flag. On Florida's state flag, you'll see that red cross of St. Andrews.
Can you pull that up, Steve? The Florida flag? I need some history on Florida.
White background with a red St. Andrews cross in the middle.
Okay.
That's the same cross you see on the Confederate battle flag.
That's the Confederate cross.
Shit, look at that.
It's basically the same state flag as Alabama. You can pull up the Alabama state flag. It is virtually identical to Florida's, aside from the seal. The seal is, of course, different. By the way, both Florida and Alabama put that St. Andrew's cross on their state flag not right after the Civil War, but actually in the 1890s. They do it right within the same years. And that's in the 1890s as well.
And that's the Reconstruction period?
This is after Reconstruction.
After Reconstruction.
Yeah, because Reconstruction really winds down in the late 1870s. So in the 1890s, Mississippi puts the full-on Confederate battle flag on its state flag, and then Alabama and Florida put it kind of like halfway on with just that cross.
They were 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Yeah, and you might wonder, wait, why would these? So talking about the Confederate battle flag is one of my favorite things to talk about.
Yeah,
there's so much mythology.
There's so much mythology and confusion.
Yeah, and it's just so much actively toxic deception relating to this flag. But so these three states put that banner on their state flags in the 1890s.
Okay.
And there's a very simple reason why. Because in the 1890s, they felt that white supremacy was under attack and under threat in their societies. And they wanted to kind of bolster white unity and to make a common front against black success and black challenges in the political spectrum. The 1890s, so this is why I'm so fascinated with Red Dead Redemption 2 and the fact that it's also a Southern game and a Western game. People, the stereotype of Red Dead 2 is that, it's a Western, it's a cowboy game. Well, yeah, sure, it is that in some senses. But then a huge chunk of the game plays out in the Deep South in the 1890s. The 1890s is that same decade that Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi put that Confederate battle flag on their state flags.
Oh, wow.
So this is a really important decade in Southern history. I think when we think about big decades in Southern history, we think about the 1860s, the Civil War, or the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement. But I would say the 1890s is actually the third most important decade in Southern history, because it's at this moment that white supremacy, white rule, white power comes under tremendous threat. And as a result, there's this huge backlash to try to, reshape Southern society to bolster and reinforce white supremacy. So the flags have everything to do with this. It's in the 1890s that the South also begins building these monuments to the Confederacy, right? Like these big, tall statues that have been getting torn down in the last, 5 years.
Yeah.
Those start coming up in the 1890s, not in the 1860s or 70s, not right after the war, in the 1890s, a full 30 years after the Civil War is over. In the 1890s is when the first Jim Crow laws are passed. It is when, you see those signs that say for colored, for white, right? Those did not exist really systematically until the 1890s. In the 1890s is when they begin popping up. So the 1890s is this moment of tremendous change in Southern history, where there's a threat from below, basically a threat of poor whites and poor blacks potentially coming together to challenge the bigger system, and then this tremendous backlash, which brings Confederate flags on on state flags, which brings statues, which brings all the Jim Crow laws, this total reorganization of the South, which is then going to stay in place for the next 70 years until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s.
Can you give me just the 30,000 foot overview of the history of the origin of the Jim Crow?
Yeah,
comes from a comedian play or something.
Right. So Jim Crow is not actually a real person.
Right.
It was a character in minstrelsy shows. Right. So that's minstrelsy is something most Americans don't know much about.
Right.
It's best that we forget it. It's something that tried to sweep under the rug. But minstrelsy is really America's first pop music genre. It starts in the 1820s and 1830s.
Minstrelsy?
It's white people putting on blackface and singing songs about black people that's meant to parody them and belittle them and this sort of thing. And this is this is not just a Southern thing. This is an American thing. It's like in New York.
Minstrel.
In New York City, you could go to minstrel shows in the 1830s and 40s. That'd be wildly popular. So one of the common characters in these minstrel shows was a character named Jim Crow. And he was meant to be, this sort of, stereotypical, uneducated, backwards African-American.
Okay.
So when these laws start coming around in the 1890s, people start calling them Jim Crow laws because, they're kind of tangled up with this older history of racism.
Was there a
South.
proper name for them, or how did Jim Crow laws stick? Like, obviously, like,
they're not formally called that. Like when the states
Right.
passed them, they're called segregation
statutes. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
and now we just
exactly.
call them Jim Crow laws because
Right,
okay.
right, exactly. Yeah, so it's interesting. You might imagine that Southern society had always been totally segregated, and that wasn't actually true. Under slavery, for example, black and white people were often close proximity with one another. They're often, African Americans worked in white homes. They nursed white children. They're
really nursed them.
You have evidence of this happening. Yeah, to be sure, of wet nurses who would be engaged in homes. So there was very close physical contact between people, right? So then slavery ends in the South, leaves the Civil War era. And some things are initially segregated. For example, schools. First off, there wasn't much schooling at all going on in this period. Right. Very little public budgets for education. But when the first schools are created with public resources, then they're separate, right? So that happens as soon after the Civil War. And churches also tend to segregate after the Civil War. That you have black churches and white churches. But then there were lots of things that were not segregated. And really, there's this 30-year window after the Civil War when things are really fluid. Things are really unpredictable. When train cars were not segregated, when trolley cars are not segregated, when stores are not segregated, when waiting rooms are not segregated, restaurants, well, that was a little trickier. But it's only in the 1890s that you see a systematic effort to put into place massive public segregation, right? The kind that we think of, when we think of the South after the Civil War. But it only comes together quite a bit afterward. And you might wonder, why is that happening? Again, it comes back to this fear of a threat that's going to shake the foundations of the South and of white supremacy.
And this wasn't going on in the North.
Well, there was already segregation in many northern states already. Yeah.
Okay.
So that, in many ways, the South kind of imports a northern practice of segregation. So this is not a uniquely Southern institution, though it's much more. It's entrenched and legalized in law much more so in the South after the 1890s than it ever was in the North.
Right.
But there was plenty of discrimination and rules against black folks in northern states too.